was central, and Trevor Schultz was certainly one of the people that I was kind of reading. But historically, this project kind of sits into the legacy of someone like Yona Friedman, who very early on started conceiving of what you can see on the left is a prototype of a software called Flatrider, written in 1967, which was kind of a diagram of how would the operating system of something like Villa Speciale would actually play out, right? So there would be an idea that citizens or inhabitants of such a kind of an architecture would actually negotiate the construction and maintenance of this villa by this kind of form of digital interface, right? And in many ways, my practice has co-opted the medium of video games. I've worked on two commercially available video games, which are educational projects and research projects that co-opt the medium to really think of video games as a form of a design platform, right? So let me start with Blockhood. Blockhood, I'm gonna leave this video running. So Blockhood, it's a project that I started in 2013. It was a video game developed across 3 years, roughly speaking, and really tries to imagine the systems of a city as constrained by a small footprint of a city block, right? So how do you really eliminate the idea of an externality? You have to basically manage all the systems of a city within a city block. That means that you have to produce energy, you have to produce food, manage waste, all the things that sometimes we tend to kind of outsource as, into different territories. We have to, in this case, in this video game, simulate their integration and their management very specifically. So that's really creates kind of an interdependence challenge for the player. And there's an understanding that every unit would have its requirements, like trees would require water, and like that every tile, we have around 190 tiles that compose potential cities or vertical cities if you want. And all of those are interrelated by their codependence, right? So it's an interdependence matrix. And the invitation is for players to really gradually build up their own aspirations of what a city should look like. The game just doesn't really tell you what is right, what is wrong. You actually start building and you start realizing you have to complement my constructions with the resources that are being demanded by such constructions, right? So you as a player create your own problems. Again, if you're interested in any of these games, by all means, send me an email and I can send you like copies. The projects have always been free for educational purposes and so forth. The second mechanic of the game, as you can see in some of these images, has to do with the management of decay, right? There's an understanding that whatever we build, it's not so much about the investment, the initial investment cost of purchasing or kind of assembling such construction, but there's a maintenance cost. There's a kind of a stewardship and there's a kind of a sense of care that needs to be placed on such system. Otherwise, the system gradually decays. So there was this notion of entropy as a mechanic that was simulated as this assembly were gradually decaying and tending towards a kind of dystopian scenario where they would be abandoned and decayed. So the player is really encouraged to manage what you create. And finally, there was a kind of a mechanic of a cohabitation. What we can see here is that the simulation that you are producing is not really meant for humans, per se. Actually, depending on the habitats that you produce, if you create a forest, you might create affordances for different species. But if you actually create human habitation, you would actually see humans meandering around. That's the kind of the way the model was simulated. So it really didn't want to present a prerogative of creating an architecture or a habitat for humans specifically. I tend to think of this project both as a technical object that contains a series of algorithms and a series of simulations that are useful in the kind of the practice of architecture. The first one has to do with as I mentioned, the ecological interdependence between units. How do we kind of create systems of reciprocity and dependency? And the things that you can do with that is obviously simulate different supply chains, right? How does an industrial food production system perhaps operates differently than organic food production system with different yields, right? So all those paths are possible within the game. The game doesn't tell you, do this one or the other one, but rather kind of invites you to explore and see the consequences of such paths. At all times, the player is invited to evaluate. There's different data layers that the simulation, understanding that it's a real-time simulation, so some of these simulations are kind of quite diagrammatic of what they're actually doing. But for instance, we have structural data, trying to kind of eliminate that nothing would be just floating and flying, cantilevering too much. Access data, each tile has a kind of corridors that serve them. And then production data, how does the different tiles, if they have the right resources, they will produce other kind of resources, and it creates this network of reciprocity, right? These are some of the images of what you can create with the game. And there's no real optimal solution. I've kind of written and have a kind of a very clear position against optimization, suggesting that there are perhaps contingent patterns, sequences that match contexts, and that value creation in the hands of communities is always shifting, and it's co-produced with communities. And we'll see that in projects that I'll share a little bit further. But I tend to avoid having optimization criteria within my games, meaning there's no one way of getting the high score, right? There's a multiple criteria, and you have to decide as a player which one is the right one for you, right? Again, some images of what different constructions and different designs within the game are possible. Central to the exercise of using video games as a platform has been to make these projects public and available. This is not a theoretical video game. These are games that have gone in many years of development, really trying to kind of be on Steam and different platforms, really kind of trying to open a conversation with an audience. And that hasn't been easy many times. Like, you kind of really get a lot of feedback, but also criticism. So it's certainly something that it's humbling and interesting to see these creations in the hands of others. But also similar to Bloom, utilizing such video games in the context of education, in the classroom, and really utilizing some of that feedback into the development and improvement of such systems. And the second video game project that I would like to share with you today, it's called Commonhood. It's in many ways a spiritual successor to Blockhood, but it really kind of dives deeper and closer to some of the social challenges that we face today. This was again done many years ago, since 2017, and it was finally released in 2023. But the challenges then seem to be still present. Therefore, these are some of the inspirations. Octavia Butler's work with the parable of the sower and the parable of the talent. How do you exacerbate kind of a dystopian condition and invite a narrative to kind of consider forms of new forms of mutual aid. At the same time, the representation of the kind of the art of Diego Rivera. I was moving to Detroit at the time in Michigan, and the murals of Diego Rivera were certainly influential in thinking how the representation of labor was actually playing a role into the simulation, right? As I mentioned, the idea of digital twins is central. How do we create a video game that could operate as a twin, a form of twinning of reality that would actually echo some of the challenges that we see, and perhaps it would become a training ground to fork or potentially like propose alternatives, right? Which is very much what I think we do in architecture. And certainly influenced as a Chilean practitioner on the work of Por un Habitar Digno, which is a group that started going to the street during the social uprising that happened during the 2019. The idea of kind of demonstrating in public space how does architecture really tell a story of inequality, right? So the video game Commonhood really proposes a playground for considering dispossession and the possibility of a community to kind of find its new grounds, like facing scarcity, right? In many ways, it's a design platform that is mediated by scarcity. So let me share a little bit more about the project as I play some of the trailer. So in Commonhood, you play a character that is invited, is very much looking at the maker movement and thinking how we can utilize our hands, our sweat equity, to construct communities, right? So you become you start occupying this abandoned factory, and you're invited to kind of conceive the architecture and the habitats and discovering many characters that would actually are in a similar conundrum, right? Not being able to, left behind in a way by the economy. The video game doesn't believe in any form of abundance, so every material that you're able to wield has to be collected, salvaged, processed, cut, right? If you think that you're modeling in something like Rhino or Blender, here you don't have copy-paste, right? So you actually have to process the material. You basically run out of lines. You run out of materials rather quickly. So it really places emphasis on how does scarcity of materials play a role in the way we design and we conceive of architecture. What you can see here is that the video game really offers a form of authoring content, user-generated content that is produced by players. You could, very much like a BIM model, group a design, share that with others. And while the download is a blueprint, you still have to provide the materials to execute that design, right? So the invitation is, how do we observe the lateral propagation of knowledge from one player to another one? And with an awareness that the amount of energy, the amount of labor that is required in each assembly varies, and it's certainly present at all times. I did these slides thinking that I would like to share some of the computational challenges in a project such as this one. Again, looking at this game as a technical object as well, the algorithms that are behind it. The first one, similar to Blockhood, has to do with the production network, right? So one machine would be able to produce materials, and that would feed another one, and there would be like a network of sequential production that would be gradually built by the player, right? So you would acquire machines or build a machine, and that would allow you to kind of expand your material capability. The second one is the user-generated content, meaning that the player is able to construct, like in Minecraft or many other games, designs by creating meshes and gradually kind of designing and grouping those designs into the platform. The next one has to do with pathfinding techniques, right? Like, you're not playing as a singular individual, you're actually playing a whole community. So while you can take action as a first-person character in the world, you're also organizing members of your community and working with members in the community which are autonomous entities, right? So they're like non-playable characters, but you can actually ask them to do certain things. So they would actually navigate through the terrain, actually do farming, collect materials for you, and help you in your endeavors, right? Behind such model, there's kind of a behavioral tree that starts identifying what are the hierarchies, or like, you know, the kind of motivations of the different characters, so that they're not just automatons that serve what you're asking them to do, but rather they have their own motivations and their own kind of prerogatives within the world. The idea of a platform is to think that we could have within a video game an interface where players can share with each other, right? Not only share a design, as we discussed, but rather share ideas, perhaps ideas of forking, interest, as we would have in a digital network. And that platform is thought to be a platform for the propagation of architectural knowledge. Within the user-generated content, the design of each one of these assemblies, we're not storing the meshes, the data of the geometry, but we're storing what a player has done in space. That means that if I timestamp that a player clicked here, I can reconstruct the mesh by you know, the algorithm would actually reconstruct the mesh in that location, right? What that allows us is that we can actually create a timeline. So we can actually move back that timeline, and the construction completely disappears, and we can gradually see how a player, step by step, builds something sequentially, right? Also, that keeps the files much lighter, and it really is it was a way of thinking of how does the knowledge of architecture get propagated. It wasn't necessarily through the complexity of the mesh, it was more about the sequential actions of players, right? And some of the biggest challenges had to do with the multiplayer aspect. The game operates as a multiplayer game where you can play with like 12 plus people across platforms in Xbox and in PC. So that was certainly a big challenge that required kind of probably a couple of years of dedicated work. this is, again, some of those images that I share with Blockhood. Having a project like this in the internet, in the wild, if you want, is certainly a challenge, and certainly it's its own kind of form of outreach, right? In many ways, I keep going back to the idea of how do I integrate a kind of maybe more profound conversation of this with the audience. And as you'll see in the projects that I will conclude with, there's kind of an interest of getting closer and closer to the player. While a digital platform might reach a large number of players, sometimes that connection seems a bit distant. So we've kind of found mechanisms, sometimes through exhibitions, or for instance, in this case, utilizing the video game to organizing a workshop where different players would co-design or kind of negotiate the design of a neighborhood with each other, and starting to document the kind of conversations, the kind of negotiations that would happen, and as they do so. Right? This was shown at the MAC in Vienna, really kind of documenting a session that took 4 hours, but we shrunk that session into like 10 minutes or so, and demonstrating how such negotiations could happen as mediated by the video game. And some of the different exhibitions where this has been shown. Here in New York, the Harlem Gallery of Science put together an exhibition called Video Games, the Great Connector, and that has been one of the motivations for me to kind of really start reaching out to different communities, both in Detroit, where I was based, and currently, now that I moved to New York, hopefully I'll be able to kind of continue this work here. So I want to share a little bit this idea of co-design. This is a project that we finished most recently. The intention to kind of connect more closely with players was also an intention to open up how do we design games, and the idea of the design coming purely from a development team was questioned, was opened up, and suggested by our team, together with Ishan Pal Singh, Tori Smith, and Salam Rida. We put together a proposal to develop a series of video game workshops at the Boys and Girls Club in Detroit, and later an exhibition that would be then staged at the Michigan Central building. And working with our community partners, we kind of managed to secure having an exhibition towards the end of. Sorry, let me just kill the audio. So I wanted to share with you a little bit the work. This took around 2 months of development. The work we did ahead of time, these were a series of video game workshops that were intending to teach students from Detroit, Michigan, how to develop video games and how to do so using an open source library of code that I've been working on that really kind of facilitates the production of a video game to maybe a couple of sessions, right? Obviously, there's kind of certain limitations to that library, but it certainly was a point of entry for students that had no prior knowledge on coding and programming, and really was an experience of really working with kind of high school students to engage things like Unity and certainly a different kind of value system of what is the kind of games that they would like to produce, not perhaps the ones that we were trying to produce in the first place, right? So the imagination of the city was not just purely imposed. In this case, was actually very much coming from their interaction. Some images of the workshops. We very much use this model. There's this game called Overcooked, if any of you have played it. So we work on multiplayer games. All of the games are multiplayer. They're local multiplayer games that try to kind of universalize resource management system. And we created a series of templates that would allow students to think of their own resources, how they're transformed, how they can manage between 4 players, and very much really thinking of how collaboration could happen when you, like games like Overcooked are interesting in that extent that they actually allow you to think of the coordination between 4 players. And that was a very important premise for us in the workshops. So let me get a bit of audio here to share with you some of the testimonies of students.
Hi, my name is DeCarla. I am in 8th grade. I'm 14 years old and I attend SOAR Academic Institute.
My name is Emmanuel Henry.
Oop, sorry.
Hi,
I am 14 years old. I go to UPrep Art and Design High School.
My name's Devin, and
Sorry,
I
some issue. again.
Hi, my name is DeCarla. I am in 8th grade. I'm 14 years old and I attend SOAR Academic Institute.
My name is Emmanuel Henry. I am 14 years old. I go to UPrep Art and Design High School.
My name's Devin, and I'm a student at Northwestern, and I'm in 10th grade. And I'm 15.
Hi, my name is Isis. I'm 17 and I am a senior at Detroit School of Arts.
Hi, my name is Tyler. I attend Pembroke Academy and I'm in the 8th grade. And my favorite game is Call of Duty.
Video game is the arts. It's an amazing arts. And if it's done correctly, millions will like come to see it. But also, if it's really good, it can be sensational. Like it can be generational. Like people will still be talking about like how GTA, well, how we still need GTA 6, right? Like we still waiting on GTA 6.
When people play my game, I want them to think of Detroit. I want them to think of how working together can make a big accomplishment.
The idea of the game is you collect scrap, so then you could make a window or a door or something. You can make a house, medium-sized parts, and you could also sell those medium-sized parts for just points.
Something real from Detroit that's found in our game is just the music scene. So for our game, the music that we stuck to is jazz music and hip hop music, which are two very prominent music types in Detroit.
It's a game representing Detroit art and the types of murals created in the city.
I chose salvage because I thought it'd be really interesting, and it relates to Detroit because when you go around neighborhoods, a lot of houses are like boarded up, and it's pretty deserted. So I thought it'd be like a really good idea, considering that the game is based off Detroit.
This representing Detroit and representing one of the things that Detroit is known for, which I think or should be recognized more for, is definitely the hard work they put on their murals. Like one thing that I want them to take away is like, if it's possible, like okay, I want to go to Detroit and see some of these murals.
Yes, I think it's very important. Like there's streets named after musicians. We have the Motown Museum, which is the start point of many great musicians.
Use those resources to make something. You can use some of those things to make a house, and you could sell some of those things to make a door, to sell.
I think that I like the cats and dogs part, but I think it's just cool that we're salvaging stuff and then making it like new. So we're renewing things pretty much in a way.
Because I got to work with my two friends / partners, DeCarlo and Emmanuel. And Emmanuel likes to try and be a leader when obviously I'm a leader. I'm a better leader than him. I just let him be leader sometimes, even though it's clear who's the better leader between us. It's obviously me. And I'm the brains of the operation.
So I just wanted to leave that there because it's a testimony that it's not as smooth sailing as it sometimes you imagine, like building these games, like the motivations behind, we did 4 games together throughout these 2 months, and really the dynamics of working with each other, working the teams that they, and their kind of motivations are certainly at the center of this endeavor. From my side, there was, as I mentioned, like a library that was trying to kind of create a series of potential interactions, anticipating what the students might or might not want to do, and testing some of those library ideas with my own students in Michigan. This is some of the work of my students, demonstrating how a simple library, which is kind of graphically agnostic, could actually be utilized for very simple simulations and management of, we utilize the tragedy of the commons of how does 4 players in this case manage and have stewardship for a simple like neighborhood. Right? And again, yeah, the work of some other one of my students really looking at dynamics of gentrification as kind of demonstrating in a very kind of in a petri dish-like environment, very small simulations, and all of those are kind of achieved rather quickly with no programming skills with this kind of library, right? So this is the class of Detroit at Play. And just to share with you a little bit, the games, you can find them on each.io. They're free to play. And there are 4 games, Detroit Card Customs, Art Alley, Let's Dance, and Junkyard Mayhem, and their respective teams. And we always imagined that the presentation of such work would be an opportunity to really engage with not only the communities we were developing games with, but their families, but also with the architecture community, and would be a point of encounter, kind of a bridge between sometimes groups that don't meet each other enough. So we designed an installation that was set up in the Michigan Central building in Detroit. And here you can see the stage that we put together. The design really tries to invite us to kind of give play a special space and kind of give play, staging play in such a way that would really invite, elevate play, if you want, to become kind of a social ritual, one that we would utilize to kind of open up conversation and dialogue, right? So this is some of the...
Y'all did a really great job.
The documentation of we did a short film, a short documentary film with the documentation of the workshops and the exhibition, so you can see that in our website, detroit.play.com. So these are kind of small moments of that film that kind of document the way in which we were kind of conceptualizing the video games, but also staging them as a form of public engagement. Again, some additional images of the events. And always really paying attention to how people work together, right? Some of my current interest is really kind of moving from single-player games to multiplayer games and really kind of observing much more precisely the dynamics of cooperation. This was a kind of a great interview that we had with one of the mothers of one of the kids, and certainly kind of hearing their kind of interests and prerogatives. It's a motivation and a direction that influences where we're going to go next. I want to be mindful of time, that's why I'm moving a bit fast, but I have one final project to share with you, which is where I'm at. It's a project that hasn't been published, but it's a project that I've been working on for maybe a year or so, which really tries to kind of much more, maybe intimately, look at the question of a digital reenactment. And that project is called Minga. As I mentioned, I'm originally from Chile, and in Chile there's this process called the Minga, which is it's a practice of reciprocal labor. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of this ritual that happens in the south of Chile, in the island of Chiloé, where a community decides or sees the necessity to relocate a piece of infrastructure, that being a house or a church in many cases, and they work together to kind of relocate this piece of infrastructure across the landscape. And that often requires a whole town, a whole community to do so. And it requires also to take this piece of infrastructure through the sea and the canals to finally arrive to their desired location. The reason for doing so varies, but there's a kind of a strong sense of reciprocity, of how communities are aware of each other and how they're willing to kind of work together to relocate this infrastructure. So in many ways, the project that I'm putting forward for this simulation, it learns from this tradition, doesn't try to reinvent it in any way, but rather kind of tries to echo it and share it as a model that we ought to be learning from. It really learns from different forms of reenactment practices, as in the work of Jeremy Deller, who has utilized the medium of reenactment as a means to echo some of the historical events in the UK. And the word enactment, central to Arturo Escobar in Design for the Pluriverse, plays a role of how do we utilize these digital platforms to kind of potentially enact different worlds. And I think that the model of Minga has a lot of lessons that I would like to revisit and certainly expand and amplify the message of such a model within a digital context. So these are some of the images of the simulation that I've been working on. It's a multiplayer game that invites 4 to 12 players to coordinate by any means possible to kind of execute this kind of carrying of a house. The game is a social experiment in the sense that you won't be able to do anything alone. It's more about the kind of conversations that might happen in a room. How do players connect with each other and kind of coordinate efforts in order to kind of finally arrive to the vector movement of the house. The project is proposed to be an installation, an exhibition that's going to be shown soon. We have kind of prototype in different stages, and we've, as a studio, been working on the representation of the different forms of animation, and you can see a little bit of a prototype here in action. Central to this work is to pay attention to, as I mentioned, what happens in the room, the way in which players go from like different attitudes. What we've detected is that there's an attitude of curiosity and playfulness, of discovering what is possible within the simulation, to transitioning to when someone figures out what is possible, how that information gets propagated across the network, for later transitioning to the model of coordination, where we actually see players executing the pulling of the house and the carrying of the house across the territory, to finally taper into sometimes boredom or people that might have to move away. This cycle requires a critical mass of players to do so. So there's a kind of a dynamic of finding enough players as this installation kind of finds the right amount of people to be executed. The data collection has to do with the possible paths or the different paths that people have taken, the heat maps of interaction, as well as the qualitative aspects of interaction in a timeline that goes through different stages and cycles, as I just mentioned. So we're really trying to find forms of diagramming that as well. And some final images. So hopefully I will be able to share more of this project in the future, but this is where we're at. I hope that this gives you like an idea of what the medium is possible, what a practice of architecture and design is able to do with video games, and I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jose. Super great to see all this work and very like interesting and captivating like sense of like an architectural computational design practice that's probably of great reference for everyone here. Does anyone have any questions for Jose right off the bat? I have a couple mics here, and if you just raise your hand, I'll come and walk it over. If anyone else has any more questions, raise your hand and I'll give you the next mic.
Hi, thank you so much. This was super interesting. I was curious for your work in game design, specifically the ones you kind of showed earlier on that have like these themes of labor, perhaps like growing and finding resources, that are very like time intensive. I wondered how you thought about sort of like honoring the like difficulty of like the duration of time in that, and like balancing that with like user engagement and like the game aspects of yeah.
So I think it's natural that you would have to exercise a compression of time to achieve any of the simulations. Many games have these compressions in the form of a slider where you would actually dynamically like fast forward or slow down. In Common Hood, we implement this mechanic where time passes quicker when you do research. So you can sit down and read a book, right? And the only way of acquiring a new skill is reading a book, right? So in a way you start reading and time starts passing a bit quicker. So that's the way we implemented like time compression. But we didn't want to give full control over that process. There was a sense of like, if you're going to speed up time and the game is really trying to pay attention to the way in which you would build, and that would have its own tempo, we didn't want you to be able to kind of put all your community to work and then press, fast forward and see the thing finish, because that would kind of go against the ethos of scarcity in a way, right? And time being one of those. But there was a mechanic where you would ultimately read this book and you wouldn't just wait, right? So there was some ways of kind of navigating time compression and dilation. So certainly an important chapter. I think that you are, within a simulation like this ones, you're not operating obviously in real time. There are games such as idle games that you can play and you have to come back. The game kind of operates at exactly the same pace of the real world. And I find them interesting, but they invite you to kind of almost as an act of gardening, kind of come, maybe play a little bit one day and then you don't come back until the next day. In this case, it's really been designed, the time loop, I think it takes around 20 minutes to finish a day in Commonhood. So it's really thinking of a session, the time span of how much a player would play and what can you achieve within that time span. So it's kind of, certainly in a general sense, compressing the experience of labor. It's not perfectly mapped, but it does give you the pacing and the tempo, which some people find fast, some people find slow. We've had both kind of forms of feedback. Some people say, like, I cannot do anything in a day. It feels like too quick. And I want the game to be slower paced, but some others feel like I need days to pass for certain things to achieve. So it's a difficult balance, but yeah, I think that that's part of the design proposal.
Thanks so much for the talk. I once heard from a video game designer that they start the design process of every game in Excel just because they claim that in Excel you can model the mechanics of any video game, and they like to start with mechanics. But for you in particular, what's the first step you take when you're designing a new video game? Do you start with mechanics, or do you envision, for instance, the look and the feel of it, or where do you start?
So my process, I have probably like hundreds of notes of like game ideas, of like, and I start kind of mapping and drawing the interactions. And I think that the building blocks of a game are interesting to me. Like I have a very discrete type of approach to a game or to design in general, as you probably saw, where I think of the parts and then I start mapping what those parts could do, right? And some parts have obvious interactions and some parts have like what I would like games call a combo, right? Like a combination that is special and it feels like it's kind of, exciting. So starting to see that the syntax of a game has interesting potential and kind of configurations that are rare and interesting. So very much go from parts, building blocks, to the syntax, the grammar of the game, and start going from that. That's kind of my design. It definitely makes sense. All the games that I've done implement a very strong kind of database approach to blocks, events, everything is part of a database. So from dialogue to anything that could happen is thought as something that could be expanded upon. So doing it in Excel is useful for us to work as a team where people can collaborate, and importing that into the game, it's certainly useful. We have tools for that, but I tend to kind of diagram more and think of those parts. Miro has been a great tool for things like that. In Blockhood, we didn't have Miro, so Blockhood probably started much more on just that was my first video game, so it was more of a building up a database within Unity and starting to kind of gradually aggregate the blocks and starting to think of those synergies. But I would say, yeah, the kind of the building blocks and their kind of relationality.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a quick question about like the user interface thing. Like, so most of them is like really interactive thing, and like they're using like console game thing or any kind of like things they are handling with their hands. So I'm wondering like which step, like when you think about like user interaction and interface, when you imagine like the next game, and after that, next question is like which technology are you focusing on like for the next step for next game, like especially like mixed media, like mixed reality, like VR, AR thing.
Yeah, that's interesting because when you do a commercial game that wants to reach a large audience, it's very standardized the way in which we have to interact. So you have to kind of conform just working with a controller, like an Xbox controller or a PlayStation controller, or keyboard and mouse. It's kind of imperative to reach large audiences. So projects such as Minga, or even Detroit at Play in some degree, reduce the demand of an audience, meaning we can do it in a gallery, we can do it in a community, right? We can stage it more purposefully. And that opens the door to, I think that you're kind of hinting at that, it opens the door to innovate or even experiment with what are the means by which you engage with it, right? And I think that there's a lot of beautiful work where game designers in such settings design their own custom controllers, their own means of engagement. So I'm doing part of that. That's some of the research we're opening, not just designing a controller, but designing the architecture, the spatial setting in which this game might be played. What are the kind of feedback mechanisms that are given to the player to take decisions? What do you have already as technology? For instance, your phones already might be able to establish very interesting communications that are not necessarily having a controller, like the phone becoming a controller, but perhaps there are other ways in which larger audiences could interface and dynamically interact with a simulation. So that's why the name of the talk and the game of the lab that I'm building in Cornell has to do with mediated assemblies, right? Is how do we kind of creatively think the way in which we kind of dialogue in the internet, in my view, has been driven into like echo chambers. We tend to talk to each other or kind of speak to ourselves in many ways, but we are missing different forms of interactivity where we can actually create kind of collective efforts, right? So I think that finding the training places and creating installations and exhibitions that would actually exercise that imagination and reforge our capacity to do so, it's in my interest. So would it be like very physical, the interaction? I cannot tell, I mean, I haven't done the design yet. It's certainly part of the interest, but it's part of the agenda, yeah.
Hi, Jose. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. I think your this kind of simulation design approach is so inspiring in so many ways. So my question would be, have you ever considered extend this kind of practice into other like non-architectural domains? Because like I already see you have projects that are supporting education for young adults. And from my personal opinion, I can see some of like the technologies, the approaches you used being used in like public health. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what are some future directions for you?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that I recently participated or attended the Games for Change Festival here in New York that happened last week. The Games for Change Festival is a festival that really like thinks of games in a whole series of domains, thinking of how games can actually not just be for entertainment but for impact. And a lot of kind of the games have to do with medical health. Some of them have to do with architecture, education in different degrees. So if you're interested in this space, and if I may kind of give some advice, a program like this would give you tools and would expand your possibility to go in many different directions. So I maintain that relationship with architecture quite closely. Like we have a small studio, and so there's so much we can do. But there's many instances in which this research frames itself and it finds a setting and a community, like as you're mentioning, dialogues and kind of learns from what is happening in medical fields or kind of studies for accessibility and others. So the field is quite wide. There's another field that is kind of overlapping this notion, which is the CSCW, which is computer-supported collaborative work, right? That really, again, a lot of medical attention of how do we create collaborative work that is mediated by computers, right? So by no means is kind of dominated by architects. It has a lot of different people from different fields participating in those fields. So yeah, it's useful to kind of obviously bring something to the table. The research kind of lends itself to kind of participate in those dialogues, but you're right, it kind of is able to go different places. I think that I'm very open to collaboration, and I think that that's the way in which a project might find domain expertise, but currently has been operating very closely to architecture, so I don't have those collaborations actively at the moment.
That's exciting, thank you.
I have maybe like a little bit of a related question to that. One thing that's really fascinating about both your practice, but also the mediums that you engage with, is that you have so many different audiences of different scales. Like even in the presentation that you have today, there's so many different audiences of different considerations and different engagement levels. And I know like for you, especially with Blockhood, like architecture was the kind of core interest behind those projects. And I'm just curious, like especially once they become a larger sort of mass market thing, have you found your audience like engaging with kind of that part of it, or just what is that experience like to scale up an audience that much?
Yeah, I think that naturally, once you reach a larger audience, such as in Blockhood and Commonhood, you could observe it in the forums, right? Like the conversations, in some cases, has to do with like, how do I optimize and how do I play this level in the best possible way? And in some other cases, like, what does it mean for cities to follow this model? So you start seeing those conversations, and it's exciting to see that it's like writing a book. The conversation goes, you're not part of it anymore. Like you kind of provided, something that was an instigator or kind of conversation. And sometimes, obviously, there's kind of different opinions, different interpretations. I would like to see that more of that. I think that projects, I'm still learning to be less didactic, and because games really puts you in this mindset of really kind of, as an educational tool and someone that works in education as well, I tend to kind of create systems that kind of have a lot of hand-holding in a way. But that's undermining what audiences can actually do. And I think that more and more I'm kind of observing how abstraction and different open-ended exercises of how games are presented, different forms of complexity to the players, really players are able to resonate with those and kind of expand upon what that means and what might that entail. So I think that has been the journey to kind of not try to kind of spell it out completely sometimes and see what the kind of counterpart, the conversation that emerges from the audience becomes richer, I imagine.
Anyone else? Jason, do you have another one?
Thank you for the presentation. It was amazing. I had this question, like generally game environments restrict the rule, like it implies a rule for the characters to play inside, right? So you're kind of bound inside that. So how do you make a decision of how to augment how much control the environment has over the character who's playing it, and how much freedom the character has over interacting with the environment?
Yeah, interesting. Someone said once in a talk, I had this question of like, surely you want to give more freedom to the player, right? But it's interesting when you're writing software, and this is probably something that you'll see as you develop your projects and if you develop kind of interactive design, not like a user might not be able to do anything if I don't write a rule. A rule doesn't constrain action, it enables action. So I would be of the idea of creating complete freedom, but that means a lot of scope. It means a lot of kind of imagining what those behaviors might be. So you're right that there's kind of a finite amount of design of what a player can actually do. And that's kind of conceptualized quite profoundly at the core stage of the design of like, how much should we open the doors of doing? Perhaps modding or other forms of work that might happen on top of that game might open different doors later down the line, right? But I think this ties to a previous question. Like the universe of actions should be rich enough that hopefully is inexhaustible, right? So if you think of chess, right? Chess, it's a very finite moveset, but today we still have games of chess that have never been played, just by the combinatorial possibilities of the game, right? You study the patterns and you study the sequences, and there's almost like player expression. So players within a finite set can express themselves and find maybe an aggressive form of playing or a defensive form of playing. And you can create expression even if your limited rule set is incredibly strict, right? So more freedom doesn't mean that there's more, more moves doesn't mean that you're going to have more expression. I want to design a move set within a simulation that creates enough unpredictability, enough expression, enough kind of capacity to kind of imagine the kind of the forking, these kind of alternative versions of realities that we're trying to, as a community, kind of consider. But I don't want to be able to anticipate what a player might be able to do, right? So there's a lot of games that do this kind of discrete approach. They use cards or they use systems that are very modular. So if you introduce a new move, it expands the system. You gradually can expand the system over time. It's a beautiful question. It's something that I think a lot about. And it really, at the core of your design is the design of what you're suggesting, right? the design of, I would start small. If I can get just 2 interactions and create that dynamic, something like tic-tac-toe, different games have very simple interactions, but you could still create dynamic sequencing, especially if you play them sequentially. So I wouldn't just create 100 interactions to start with. I would try to keep it as small as possible initially. And not because I don't want freedom, it's just I want to see the expression of those moves more than just thinking that the moves themselves define the freedom of the player.
Thank you.
Hi, one more question. It's like silly question came up. So it might be a little personal question. What makes you keep making that kind of game? Like, what is the core thing for you to when you make a game?
What is the motivation? I guess a friend of mine in Michigan mentioned it's like you cannot help yourself to make games. So because I take notes I think of the world around us and I start thinking, oh, I would like to see that interaction played out 20, 100, 1,000 times. So I think the dynamic between this and this interaction, when I think of politics, when I think of, like supermarket resources in general, everything, I start thinking, well, there is kind of a universe of permutations and combinations that happens if you're kind of interacting these variables. So I think in a similar way in which I design games, and that lends itself to come up with ideas. It's like, this could be a little game. Like I probably, as I mentioned, I have like, many notes on possible games, and I gradually start thinking, maybe I tell my friends, would you play a game that kind of creates this conflict, this dynamic? I really want to be able to, games not to be a medium on themselves, but be able to create a dialogue, right? So if that idea starts kind of resonating with a community and starts being able to kind of pull conversations and seeing that players are taking it to wildly interesting places and perhaps some clashes, right? I think that that's an idea that's worth pursuing. So yeah, I think that there's a kind of continuous kind of imagination of how, and prototyping, right? How do you prototype something very simply and then see if that starts resonating and starting to create a kind of a dialogue, because yeah, it's difficult to evaluate games on your own.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Probably have time for 1 or 2 more.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. One of the point that I found interesting is that like most of the game I seen before was distributed by like Steam or other platform, but most of your game was in form of exhibition. So will there be some consideration that while you're designing the exhibition, please?
Yes, so in the case of like Minga, the final project I was showing you, we're working actively in the exhibition design, but Blockhood and Commonhood are both in Steam. So I think that Steam gives you like this bigger audience, right, or Xbox as well. We have Commonhood in Xbox. It gives you this bigger audience, but it becomes very impersonal. It's difficult, like I have very little dialogue with the community unless we really kind of go to YouTube or different formats. But in the case of an exhibition or especially community engagement, which I would say is far more intimate in terms of like really co-developing projects with students, the proximity to the player, it's become freer. And I think that I would like to kind of maintain both. I think that the questions that a large crowd can have over a game and how it becomes part of culture, I find that process quite interesting in its own right. But then also the kind of smaller format, you have to imagine that the people that can go to a gallery or that might go to a gallery might already participate on the kind of the discipline in which you are working. So it might have certain predisposition of the kind of interactions that it might have with the system. So might create more intimacy, but might not invite everybody to the table, if you want, right? That's why like Detroit at Play really tries to go to a particular community and work with them to kind of open up those dialogues in a different way. So yeah, forms of access, forms of who has a voice in these simulations, I think that that's been problematized at different scales. Hopefully I'll continue operating across those scales.
Anyone else for a final question? Okay, doesn't look like it, but thanks so much, Jose.
Thank you.